Welcome, everyone. Lovely to see you on this rather cold evening in Buckinghamshire. I hope you're in the warmth of your respective kitchens, maybe. I've had to come to the cold of our office because broadband at home isn't good enough. But what can you do? I had an alcohol before I set out, so that should be fine. It's lovely to have Ben Box back here with us. He's going to, as you know, talk us through a few tales about some of the recipes in his new book on Latin American food, which I've had at home for a month or so now, and I'm very much enjoying. So Ben, I think, will talk for probably about 20 minutes, something like that. I'll show his slides for him, and then after that, I've got a few pictures of Large Frontier's efforts at cooking the odd thing. And if any of you have any pictures, Jill, I have yours. We'll show them and then we'll do a quick Q&A. So let me just stop sharing my screen and show Ben's slides, if you bear with me.
Yes, thank you all for attending. It's great to see so many people here, including one of my collaborators on the cookbook, Anna Maria, who is watching from even colder up in the north of Norway. So that's very, very great to have her here. Ed's suggested topic for this brief talk is very broad, leaving a lot of leeway for me to talk about South American food. In fact, one of the hardest parts in writing the cookbook was to condense all that one could say on the subject into a concise introduction. The topics that I chose to cover range from a brief history of food in South America, food and tourism, indigenous crops and the wider subject of South America's vegetable kingdom, and a brief foray into questions of why food matters. In part, I was trying to relate to what the Brazilian chef Alex Atala of the restaurant Dom in Sao Paulo said. Let me ask you this. Which is the most powerful social media on earth? Is it Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook? No, what connects billions of people on planet Earth is food. So the future of food is very important for humanity. The basis of what Atala is talking about is an exchange. Social media, of course, being an exchange of information, of views, to put it mildly. And there are many levels of exchange regarding food, buying and selling produce, cooking food for sale, the exchange of recipes, cooking techniques, traditions and stories, innovations, and so on. The market is an obvious place to see the exchange on the ground. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is a market in Cajamarca in Peru. And as a traveler, I gravitated towards markets as good places to see local produce and the vibrancy of the local economy, how people connect to their region and environmental conditions, to seasonality, to their ethnic groups, and how the market is a hub either as a collection and distribution point for the geographical area. Next slide. Yeah, as this very well-established market in Honda in Colombia, or a weekly assembly point for people to gather and exchange their surpluses and buy what they need for the coming 7 days. The next one, please. Slightly different market in Suriname. Interestingly, historical and archaeological evidence points to the fact that one of the main differences between Mesoamerican and South American pre-Hispanic societies was that the economies of Central America and Mexico used a redistributive market system, whereas in South America, they did not. Inca society was a system in which all members were adequately fed out of a centrally controlled network of storehouses. Colcas stored crops as well as textiles, clothing, tools, weapons, and other important materials for provisioning armies, providing for festivals, and for sharing among the population in times of shortage. They were set a day's march, about 22 kilometers or 14 miles apart, on the royal roads and close to areas of intense agriculture. The next slide, please. These are a particularly fine set of storehouses above Ollantaytambo in Peru, in the Sacred Valley, at a place called Pinculuna. As harvests were distributed fairly to all within a mita system of reciprocity, one service in exchange for another, there was no need for money or for markets. This, like many other features of the Inca Empire, such as roads, architecture, communal labor, irrigation, and terraced fields, was perfected from what they inherited from the people they had conquered and the cultures that preceded them. The Spaniards were in awe of both systems, the cornucopia of produce in Aztec markets, for instance, the Inca roads and colcas, without which their conquest would not have been so easy, but they completely disrupted the Andean model, replacing it with the hierarchical European model, which left the underprivileged hungry and downtrodden. At the next slide, please. One consequence of the European conquest was the so-called Columbian Exchange, which very basically was the traffic in foodstuffs from Europe to the Americas and vice versa, added to which was the later introduction of African crops suited to the slaves' diet. And as you can see, also in the exchange is included diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and so on. The South American diet was enriched by new foods, just as the benefits of South American produce were spread elsewhere around the globe. Over centuries, the production of food became commodified as governments prioritized crops for export over domestic consumption. Investment went into monocultures, especially the introduced foodstuffs like cattle, wheat, or soya. Historical means of food production succumbed to feudal systems and industrialization. And as a means of comparison, the next slide, please, shows examples of the terraced agriculture in the Peruvian Andes, some still in use, others in the distance, not so much, compared with soya fields in Mato Grosso do Sul, which are completely empty blank spaces, but for mass production of soya. Recently, the geography of South American cookery has been changing fast in all sorts of exciting ways. Compared with the centuries of exchange that created the fundamentals of South American regional cooking, the history of this is relatively short. It's usually dated to 1986, when the Peruvian journalist Bernardo Roca Rey was invited to Lago Huacachina, near Ica in Peru, to judge a competition of chefs and their traditional Peruvian dishes. The next slide, please. Rather blurred picture of Huacachina. And Roca Rey insisted that none of the dishes that these chefs prepared was remotely traditional. He argued that the truly authentic Peruvian foods could be found in local markets and communal kitchens, particularly where people from the Sierra and jungle have fled to the cities to escape the civil strife affecting the country at the time. Next picture, please. And this shows a market in Selendín and a sort of communal cooking that goes on in the market today. The chefs who were upbraided by Roca Rey challenged him to cook them an authentic meal, which he did using ingredients from the market in Ica. The rest, as they say, is Nova Andina food history, with a cuisine that revalued local ingredients and inspired Peruvian chefs, notably the pioneer Gaston Acurio, who there's a picture of in the previous slide, and his wife Astrid Gucha. And from there in Peru, spreading to other parts of the continent. The result is a network of award-winning chefs and their establishments using all the elements at their disposal, be they ingredients from a vast range of climates and habitats, or techniques learnt in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. You have chef researchers or explorers and conservationists who scour their homelands to find new ingredients to use, to save recipes and cooking methods from neglect, and champion cooks, herbalists, and cultivators. One example is the restaurant Urku in Quito, whose menu is based around the 4 Andean seasons, or raimis, combining elements from the coast, Andes, Amazon, and Galapagos. Their ethos is to work with local communities, generating an exchange of tastes and ideas through food which is sourced responsibly and based on mutual understanding. Can I have the next slide, please? On the left is an example of a dish at Urku, which you can see is very refined, very elaborate, and very colorful. This is compared on the right with a typical Ecuadorian soup, and anybody who's been to Ecuador knows the importance of soups in the daily diet. It's rare that I would have eaten in a place like Urku, but fortunately I did. I could just as well have eaten foods like these. Next slide, please. On the left is a menu ejecutivo from Ecuador, when you see the unordained piece of meat, rice, beans, plantains, and potatoes. On the right is a takeaway meal from the Indonesian stalls on the waterfront in Paramaribo in Suriname. As I say, very Indonesian inspired, very tasty as well. Or next slide, please. This is Brazilian rice and farofa, another thing that I just as well have eaten, which is a sort of everyday dish that you will find all over Brazil. I could just as well have eaten in locations such as these. Next slide, please. These are bus stops in Peru. As in restaurants like this. The next slide, please. A buffet in Encarnacion in Paraguay, and the restaurant in the Mercado Central in Santiago de Chile. Very good seafood that you get there. Exploring the vast topic of South American food can lead down all sorts of fascinating byways and diversions. And so I thought it might be fun to see what happens if we take the 4 recipes that Ed chose, and I assure you there was no collusion between Ed and me on this, and follow a whistle-stop route, partly about the dishes and their ingredients, partly about my experiences in relation to the dishes, and see if they link up. If you will excuse a couple of tenuous connections and jump cuts, I think they do. So let's start with chipa. And these I cooked on the 7th of January. Chipa, one of the many cheesy breads from all over South America. And in this case, they are made with cassava flour, as those of you who've cooked them will know. And they include cheese. Next picture, please. These are cheeses, as it says, from Minas Gerais in the market in Belo Horizonte. Cheese is a sidetrack that I'm not going to venture down, as it's fraught with complications. Suffice it to say that for this latest batch of chipa, I used a mix of Parmesan, feta, and goat's gouda, which gave a very pleasant flavor and a gooey center. My first experience with chipa was in the early 80s, soon after I had crossed by open boat in the rain from Posadas, Argentina to Encarnacion in Paraguay. I'd been given a right old shakedown by President Stroessner's border guards, but came away with minimal loss, only a pad of AML writing paper, which rather dates the experience, and an intense desire to get out of Encarnacion as quickly as possible. It's a much more welcoming place now with its hydroelectric dam and lake, artificial beaches, and a fine bridge across the water. Next picture, please. This is one of the beaches on the lake of the Lago Yacyretá, which is the name of the hydroelectric scheme. And on that first bus to Asuncion, I tried chipa for the first time. In the book, I tell of a later bus time chipa snack, which was just as delicious. Paraguay is a great country for experiencing the phenomenon of selling goods to bus passengers, a sort of hop-on, hop-off system by the vendors who get on to sell remedies and pharmaceuticals, religious tracts, food, electronics, and everything else under the sun. Before the arrival of the Spanish colonists, chipa was made of cassava starch and water, pressed around a stick and cooked on an open fire. The Spaniards thought cassava was dangerous, so they began to introduce their preferred ingredients such as meat, dairy produce and eggs to make the chipa more to their taste. The Guarani chipa, meaning bread or cake, prevailed, and now there are dozens of types of chipa. Some say as many as 70, traditionally cooked in a tatacua, which is a big clay oven. Next picture, please. Cassava is highly versatile. It can be boiled, steamed, baked, fried, made into flour and tapioca, and into a beer. It has many different names besides cassava: manioc, yuca, mandioca, macaxeira, aipim, and Brazilian arrowroot. There are two main varieties, sweet and bitter. The latter contains a higher concentration of anti-nutrients than the former and can cause poisoning if not treated properly. And the name yuca, in fact, comes from the Guarani word juca, which means to kill. The plant was domesticated in West Central Brazil, from where it spread to become one of the main staples of South and Central America. European traders transported it to Asia and, more significantly, Africa, where in sub-Saharan regions, it's now a staple food. Of similar importance within the Colombian exchange were the famous three sustainers, beans, squash, and corn, frequently grown together as companion plants, and others such as sweet potato, cacao, peanuts, chili peppers, tomato, and pineapple. The sharp-eared among you may have noticed that I omitted potatoes from the list, but not for long, because they lead us neatly to our next dish, which is papas a la huancaína. Next picture, please. This is a good example of the exchange for its combination of indigenous potatoes and chili, European dairy produce, and olives. It also combines produce from different regions of Peru, potatoes and dairy from the Sierra, chilies from the coast. A suitable mixture given the dish's history of feeding the workers and or passengers on the Lima to Huancayo Railway. Potatoes are one of several tubers that feature in Andean cooking. Olluco, isaño, oco are others, but the potato has gained greatest global popularity, so much so that no South American country features in the top 10 of world producers. The potato is a significant part of Andean culture. We have the next slide, please. It shows rows of potatoes growing near Cotopaxi in Ecuador. Next one, please, which is Peruvian potatoes in markets in Selendín and at what was a weaving demonstration in Ollantaytambo, the picture on the right. And the next slide, please. The picture on the left shows chuño, which is the grey potatoes in the front, and tunta, the white ones behind, which are potatoes that are naturally freeze-dried in the very high altitudes where the potatoes can be frozen at night. And to get the white ones, they spray them with a mist of water before dusk falls, and that turns them white. And then they keep for many, many years afterwards. Personally, I don't enjoy them very much, but there we go. And also, just as an aside, in the market in La Paz is an excellent place for finding chilies. The potato is even worshipped in Chilean Mapuche culture, and it is said that the potatoes from the island of Chiloé are the basis of most of the contemporary world edible varieties. Next picture, please. These are some of the potatoes from Chiloé, and a picture of some Mapuche people. Talking of Chiloé, this is a part of South America renowned for its seafood. Next picture, please. It's a fishing harbor at Ancud. All along the coast of Chile, you will find wonderful fish and seafood. Next picture, please. Here are some examples. King crab on the left from Tierra del Fuego, huge crabs, and fish, seafood from the Mercado Central in Santiago. Dishes such as paella marina, machas a la parmesana, caldillo de congrio, parrillada de mariscos are very famous throughout Chile. And in Chiloé itself, they have a dish called curanto, which contains seafood, meat, and potatoes and other ingredients, all cooked underground. Following the cold Humboldt current northwards, we come to Peru with fishing ports such as Pucusana. Next slide, please, which is south of Lima, a typical harbour where the sailors have to share their catch with other fishers. And we race northwards to Lambayeque, which is particularly proud of its gastronomic heritage. And in the book, I quote from the chef Juana Zunini of El Cántaro in Lambayeque City, who enthuses about dishes such as tortilla de raya, a tortilla made of stingray, arroz con pato, which is duck with a green rice that you can see bottom right, and the indigenous squash called loche, which is depicted in moche pottery, a foodstuff that's resisted all the agricultural trends and vicissitudes over the centuries. Another speciality is King Kong. Next slide, please. King Kong is a type of alfajor with 4 layers of biscuit filled with manjar blanco or dulce de leche, either name you'll use, and fruit pastes. It is in fact an alfajor on steroids of extreme sweetness. It was invented by Senora Victoria Mejia de Garcia in the 1920s to aid her charity work. Its popularity coincided with the first version of the famous film of that name, hence the giant sweets acquiring the ape's name. As you can see, King Kong is nothing like the alfajores de maicena, which Ed encouraged us to make. And next slide, please. But the relationship does allow me to sneak in the third of our recipes. Please excuse me for skipping over the most typical of seafood dishes, ceviche, at this point. Time and the kilometers are moving on, but afterwards there may be a chance to return to it and the differences between Peruvian and Ecuadorian ceviches. And before we know it, we have arrived at our next stop, which is Salango on Ecuador's Pacific coast. Next slide, please. And here is a picture which doesn't really give an idea of the frantic nature of the frigate birds, pelicans, gulls attacking the fishermen, bringing the catch from the boats to the gutting tables. It's incredibly reminiscent of something out of the Hitchcock film, The Birds, and it's very dramatic. In restaurants and towns like this, you will, of course, find our next recipe, pescado encocado. Next picture, please. This is a pescado encocado that we made when preparing the recipes for the book. The combination of fresh fish, sweet coconut, and tart citrus is just as likely to be found further north as in small coastal communities like Nuki. Next slide, please. In the Colombian Chocó. Here you find a proud Afro-Colombian culture and small-scale harvests. As you can see, onions growing in a boat, and plantains, coconuts, and limes. But you also have an abundance of fish. Next slide, please. So I'm getting quieter. Okay, I'll speak up. From here, I'm going to make a bit of a leap from salt to fresh water, which is needless to say another excellent source of fish. From the minuscule to the meal-sized. Next slide, please. These are fish from the Pantanal in Brazil. The fish on the right are served at a buffet on a river cruise out of Corumba. And if we jump further up the scale, the giant of the freshwater fish world in South America is the araipama, or paiche, or pirarucu. The Arapaima gigas is its Latin name, which can grow up to 3 meters long and is air-breathing. It is endangered because of overfishing. In theory, it's easy to catch and spot because when the fish surfaces for air, the gulp that it makes can be heard from a long way away. Nevertheless, on the expedition that I show on the right of the slide, we didn't see one. But our guides were from the Rewa community in the Rupununi area of Guyana. Next slide, please. This is one place dedicated to research into this fish and into its conservation. When I visited there and stayed at the community lodge, as you can see the picture on the left is the site for the breakfast. You couldn't ask for a better place to have breakfast. Rewa village was hosting the annual Indigenous Sports Week in Guyana's September Heritage Month. All sorts of food and drink is served as communities get together, and there are lots of sporting events. Among them is, next slide please, a cassava speed grating competition. That's, some of us tried some of the sports, but not this, and I certainly didn't because I can't be trusted with anything sharp. And so here we are, cassava, back where we started, with chipa. In the face of big problems in South America at the moment, especially in Brazil and Peru, it is good to remember the joy that cooking and sharing food can bring. And in this highly interconnected world, there's no reason why we cannot engage with foods from other cultures, not simply by sampling, but also by trying to recreate them, however imaginatively or amateurishly. Understanding comes through the exchange of ideas and experiences, not least through food.
I'm going to just show you a few of the efforts that I know some of you got up to. Efforts being a rather harsh word, perhaps. Here, Ben, was the Last Frontiers alfajor cooking session. The one on the right was from Elliot, who went very sprinkly on his sprinkles. The one on the left was from Lizzie, who tried a mango filling just because she could. And they were both delicious and all very filling. And then what have we got next? Oh, Jill. Jill, who many of you will remember, who worked here at Last Frontiers before she went over to Belmont some years ago. Jill is really clever because she never does any cooking, and her husband Neil cooked this pescado encocado for her. It looks delicious. Apparently went down very well with a glass of wine. So thanks for that, Jill. And then we tried I tried at home the papas a la huancaína. Well, I should say that I did the ingredients photograph, and then my daughter Laura prepared this. It came out really rather well, I think, rather beautifully. We didn't quite know what to do with ají amarillo, but we found a yellow pepper. Finely chopped. I'm sure Laura will tell us if we need to know any more details. Did the job, and it tasted delicious. We had it hot, but I read in your book that it might have been better cold. Now I'm going to try it cold. But there we are. There's her son, very much enjoying his papas a la huancaína. So thank you, Jill, for sending yours in. And let me just look at the chat here. Ben, I was fascinated with the fact, I must say I hadn't realized, I thought coffee and bananas were Latin American. Very interesting to see that they were the ones going in the other direction.
Yeah,
that's more of a comment, really. Anna Maria has asked about your best and worst meal. So there you are. There's a chance to tell us something.
From the cooking the book, or from traveling in South America?
Well, maybe should we say from traveling in South America?
One of the worst meals was one that I write about in the book with some friends, very good friends and traveling companions and colleagues, Robert and Daisy Kunstater. We were in the border between Peru and Ecuador, in Ecuador, and we had a very unsuccessful morning trying to find a border crossing. And we got to a town and we asked for the menu del dia, which you can usually guarantee is going to be good, but this was absolutely disgusting. It was it was supposed to be chicken, but I don't think a chicken had seen it. And it was just rice which had been overcooked and was burnt in a dry sauce. And that was particularly unsustaining, shall we say. But we had a good laugh about it and we still talk about it. Best meals, ooh, crumbs. There have been lots of good ones. I think one of the best also was in Ecuador, and it was a tasting menu cooked by the brother of a friend of ours who is a tour operator, Yasivan Carvalho. His brother is Alvaro. And this tasting menu was all sorts of different dishes that he'd taken, foraging for plants along the rivers in the Cotopaxi National Park, and combining all sorts of elements of Ecuadorian food. And that was superb, I have to say. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Other good ones, had some very good meals in Brazil, good parrilladas and churrascos, very good party, again, which I told about in the book, in the borders of Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo state, where the meal was washed down with a caipirinha made with the names, purple berries. Names escaped me for the moment. It'll come back to me. So that ruins the point of that story. But yes, lots of very good food. But I do have to say that in the main, most of the food has been the food that you would get, like menus del dia. When you're traveling, you don't really have time to, traveling and working, you don't really have time to look at really posh restaurants. You're mostly finding food to keep you going through the day and for the next part of the work that you have to do. But yeah, yes, no complaints.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'd absolutely echo with that. Well, actually, I'm talking about a tasting menu and seeing Jeremy here on the chat from Esquel. Cassis Patagonia has got to be the one with the best restaurants I've been to in Latin America. Anyway, Hugh Sinclair has asked you, what's your view of cuy? Mentioned in the book, but no recipe, he says. Any means to eat it in the UK legally?
I have never eaten it. I've never been inspired to eat it. Partly because when frequently traveling when our daughters were younger, we had guinea pigs at home, and I just couldn't bear the thought of telling them that I'd eaten what their pets were. And now our granddaughter has guinea pigs as pets. It's just not something that's appealed to me. So that's why I haven't included recipes for it. How you cook it in the UK, I really don't know, other than raiding your granddaughter's pet hutch, I suppose. I don't know.
Thanks, Ben. And Anna Maria has asked, what are you drinking in the photo on the screen, Ben?
It's Singani and fruit juice from the area of the Sinti Valley in southern Bolivia.
Of course it is. I remembered that because it's a photo actually I stole from your last presentation when you spoke to about on Bolivia. Yeah, fantastic.
Mm.
Ben, that was great. Thank you so much.